And we are live. Thanks, Wayne. Good afternoon, everybody. Barry McGuire's Creative Real Estate Education Group now meeting. It's the Monday main event. I'm here with Andrea Workington. And thanks, Andrea. Thanks for showing up, Andrea. It's always nice when you show up and help us out. I know you're very busy. I know Wayne's busy. Everyone's busy, but you guys always show up and help out. So I do appreciate that.
You're welcome.
All right. So this is a continuation of a session that we did on diligence. Diligence is the process of investigating something that you're going to do, whether it be purchasing a house or getting a new bike or a new pair of shoes. Diligence is the checking and looking that you do to figure out whether you're going to buy something. It's how you do a buying decision, how you make a buying decision. And then once you've accomplished what you think is enough diligence, then you can say with confidence, I've done my due diligence. And then you buy or not buy, depending. So during our first session, which was a few weeks ago, we just talked about that concept and some of the basic things that you do when you're looking at purchasing perhaps a single family. You're buying it for yourself, you're buying a condo or a duplex to rent out. And it's just the very most basic kinds of diligence. And there were so many things to talk about that we didn't even get finished that very opening, you'd think, small kind of topic. So we're going to pick up where we left off and start again and see where we get to. We might have to do this more times for all I know. So we're going to go hard till 6 o'clock. And so let's get going. I'm looking at my list here. And when we talked about the single family side of things, we didn't talk about what kind of diligence you should do if you're buying a property that has an existing suite in it, an existing secondary suite, usually in the basement, or it could have a garage suite, or it could have a garden suite. And I guess as part of that, we didn't talk about whether or not what you would like to do is put in a secondary suite, either in the basement or the garden or in a garage. So because suites are so important now, and because the suite landscape has changed so much, let's talk a little bit about you just want to put one in. You're looking at a property, you'd like to put in a secondary suite. There isn't one there at the moment. So Andrea, let's go to you now. In your part of the country, central Alberta, based in Red Deer, but I know you work in lots of cities or towns around Red Deer. If you're looking at a property and considering a suite, what do you do, and is it different for different municipalities?
Great question, Barry. Yes, it is. So for example, in Red Deer, around 2010, we were encouraged to step forward with any secondary suites that we had to get them legalized so we could grandfather in back then just having one furnace as an example. And so as long as we met the fire safety codes, we did not have to put in a secondary furnace. So after that time period finished, you now in the city of Red Deer would have to have two separate heat sources. But another thing that's important for people to know is geographical areas may have a cap on how many secondary suites that you can have. So for example, in Red Deer, there's a few neighborhoods where you cannot add any more secondary suites. So if you're buying a house thinking, okay, you're near the college in West Park and you want to put in a secondary suite, it's a no-go. There is still quite a few mother-in-law or illegal suites in that neighborhood, but the city does crack down on them over time. And so if that was your great plan, was to add a secondary suite, you certainly can do so in certain neighborhoods of Red Deer. Same thing in Sylvan Lake, actually. Sylvan Lake has their own secondary suite bylaws, their own set of rules on how you apply for that. And again, it's more of by geographical area. And part of that is to prevent one geographical area from having too many of them. And usually the biggest issue is parking. So for example, the city of Red Deer says, okay, how many bedrooms are in between main floor and basement? You have to provide a certain amount of parking. And so I think most municipalities is the same. You know, if you have a house on a corner lot, you're way more likely to get a yes because you have that corner parking area. So just to give an example, that's kind of, you know, an important thing. Whereas the town of Black Falls kind of almost goes on a block by block area as to how many secondary suites can be in that block. Town of Lacombe has a 10% factor. They only want 10% of their houses to have secondary suites. So each geographical area is a little bit different. So you're best to talk to the development office or the inspections and licensing office to find out what you need to do.
Wow, that's interesting. So, you know, as you know, I started practicing real estate law last year, and I've gained quite a bit of experience in that time. And I just have not so far in my 1 year run across the notion that secondary suites are limited by number in the area. I didn't know that. I don't think there is that limitation in Edmonton, but that's, you know, that's a brand new fact for me. So that's why I listen to these kinds of programs, because I'm learning new stuff all the time. Neil, welcome. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for being here.
You're
welcome. We're just talking about what you do if you're looking to put a secondary suite in a property you own, be it garden or secondary in the basement or a garage suite. And Andrea was talking about what it's like in central Alberta. So Andrea, just to carry on a little bit. So if you thought to yourself, okay, I'm a careful person. I'd like to do my diligence. I'm going to find out whether or not this house is zoned for allowing a secondary suite. So if you just checked that aspect of things, say online, would an online check in Red Deer or Black Falls or any of those other limited by area restriction places, would it say to you, yes, overall we allow secondary suites, but we do have this restriction? Would it pop right out at you, or do you have to dig deeper?
Well, that's a fantastic question. And the answer is yes to both ways, actually, because in the older communities of Red Deer, basically before 2005, any of those houses you could apply to have a secondary suite. Now, like I mentioned, there's certainly some ones they look more favorably upon if you're on a corner lot, but that doesn't mean if you're zoned for a single family that you can't get a secondary suite. Whereas in the newer areas, what they did is they selected specific lots that you could build. It didn't mean that the person did build a secondary suite, but there were specific lots. And that's how they capped the percentage of secondary suites in the neighborhood. So for example, in my neighborhood here, so this community is only 7 years old, when they did the lot draw with the city, there was very specific lots that were designated for secondary suites. And once those lots were gone, you could not do, there was no discretionary use for doing a secondary suite. It was that's done. So if you tried, which a builder did a few years ago, because there's still a few houses being built in my neighborhood, they went the route of, we're just going to do it and ask for permission afterwards. Well, they ended up having to take it out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So it's very important to know. And like I said, Red Deer has, different neighborhoods had different rules because of the zoning. Yeah.
Wow. That is that's so amazing to learn that, because there's just a whole bunch of different things in there that you need to know in Red Deer about secondary suites. And so it's, maybe easier for somebody who's in the business and who lives in the area. But this is one of the things that folks who are thinking of buying out of their own area. I mean, if you're a person who lives in Red Deer and you want to buy in Winnipeg, or if you're someone in Toronto who wants to buy in Kimberley, BC, I mean, you need some specific help on the ground, because these are the little twists and turns and subtleties of diligence that you won't know. Maybe not even if you live in Red Deer, but certainly it's going to be hard on you if you don't live there. Neil, let's go over to you and talk about Airdrie and area, and maybe you can also add on comments. Yeah, Airdrie and area, and then maybe about Calgary and how you see that as Calgary as being different than Edmonton on the secondary suite side of things.
I'll start with Airdrie because that's where the majority of our portfolio is, Barry, and certainly that's where my working knowledge is with regards to suites and land use bylaw. In Airdrie, it was not even really in the language of the land use bylaw until about 215, 216 is when they did the amendment to allow secondary suites. The big however of that is that secondary suites are only a discretionary use. They're not a permitted use, and there's no zoning that I'm aware of in Airdrie where it's a permitted use. And the big distinction between those two is if you wanted to build, you have a lot and you want to build a detached garage, and the garage you're putting in is within the lot coverage size, the square footage, the height restrictions, where you place it. If you meet all of the rules within the bylaw, you go down to city planning and you apply for your garage, and they stamp it when they look at your plan. They say, go ahead, here's your building permit. If you go to do a secondary suite, there are minimum parameters in Airdrie, such as a 13-meter lot width, a 400 square meter lot size, and then rules, again, like Andrea had mentioned, that center around parking. In Airdrie, we need one parking spot per bedroom in the secondary or garage suite, which can be a challenge. And I know that just for a second, looking over the fence into Calgary, if you have a 2-bedroom suite in Calgary, a lot of places don't even require 2. It may only be 1, and I'm not sure because I'm not really up to speed on Calgary at that level, but some of them I think might even be no additional parking depending on where they're located. Because I know there were some apartments downtown, condos that were built in the East Village, where the developer was able to say to the city, a lot of these people are going to walk to work, and they got away without having to provide parking stalls for those condos when they were built. So secondary suites, it's definitely not one for one. It may, I don't know enough about it. So come back to Airdrie. So now you want to put your suite in. You go in, and let's say you actually find a lot which is 13 meters in width, which the majority of lots after say 1990 or so aren't that wide, and maybe even in the 80s. If you don't have any variations to that, they will approve it at planning, but then it gets published to the paper and goes up for 3 weeks of potential appeal, and someone can file an appeal to have it overturned, and it goes to another board called Subdivision Development and Appeal Board. I don't know, this isn't being recorded, right? So I can say there's a little bit of NIMBYism. Oh, it is being recorded, so I won't say that. And typically, from listening to a couple landlords who have tried that, we know some have gotten them put through, and it's either that their neighbors maybe were landlords, or they had some discussions that didn't care, and they won't consider an appeal from someone who isn't directly affected. So really they send it to all your adjacent neighbors, or in the case of ours, it was over the back alleyway. And so we had one that was actually approved at Municipal Planning Commission because there were variances to the requirements under the bylaw that municipal planning said were reasonable. They granted us our building permit, I guess, and it got overturned at SDAB. So it's not a huge sample size, and we hear of a fair number of frustrated landlords who can't get it done. And if you dial that clock back about 14 years ago, there was a bus tour that went through Airdrie, and we all sat in at lunchtime, and the economic development folks all said to us, yeah, we know there's a pile of illegal secondary suites here, and we don't really care. And certainly a lot of investors took that to heart. And so we have had 2 suited houses that have become single family, and with the little bump in the market, they both got sold in the last 60 days. So tricky. And I think to bring it back out from Airdrie, the easiest answer is if you're looking in a municipality where you're not, like if Andrea's in Red Deer, she knows. She'll probably double check it. But if Andrea is going to Edson, for lack of knowing what Edsons are, maybe Andrea already knows, one of us would check, and both of us would check before we agreed to do something that was predicated on a suite being the solution and making that asset perform. So that's the easiest way to put it. It's not a provincial statute. It's definitely municipal.
And so do you know about other communities around Airdrie? Do you have maybe one other example of a fairly near community where you know how they do it, or are we just
I'll
talking
venture into
Airdrie?
Calgary and touch on it, other than to say, check with the real people who are living and breathing and doing Calgary, and they're not hard to find in the group. But Calgary has had a program in place because they understood that they need affordable houses, and the densification and all of those issues need to be addressed. So they were encouraging landlords to bring their illegal suites out of the shadows, so to speak. And what they did is they grandfathered. If you can prove that there was an existing illegal suite in the property prior to, and right now that program is still open, then you did not have to have the suite brought right up to the current building code. And I'll give you an example of it. Our illegally suited house in Airdrie that we sold was done and developed in about 2008, 2009, when the building code was a 30-inch window well on a basement window. So we cored the window in to provide egress. For us, it was always a case of, would I sleep there? Would I feel comfortable in having my family, my kids sleep there? And that is a different thing. That's more in the fire code and the building code than necessarily the bylaw. So we had to pull out some perfectly good 30-inch window wells because the new building code is 36 inches. Because when our suite got overturned approval, they said, wait a second, you have basement development there? Yeah, it's not approved. So we need you to bring the basement up to code otherwise. And so the short version is, in Calgary, they're grandfathering old suites in as far as building codes. They have pushed back what they call that amnesty date more than once. It was supposed to have ended at the end of, the first time might have been in 19, and then they pushed it to mid 20 and maybe the end of 20s when the pandemic hit. And my latest understanding is it's now somewhere, it may be right at the tail end of this year in 2021. So there are a number of investors who are jumping on illegally suited properties in Calgary, buying them, renovating them, and realizing a lift in value beyond what they pay for it, plus their legalization costs. They're getting an appraisal value that is higher ARV in that case, because now it's legally suited. And the city of Calgary has gone so far as to say that they have a safe suites registry on their website. So once you're approved, then they list your address. And the talk that I've heard is that the rent fasters of the world have agreed that unless you're on the registry, they won't advertise your place for you once that amnesty period is over. So does it keep getting extended because of COVID, or does it keep getting extended because they're not satisfied with the take rate on people legalizing suites? You could argue it either way.
That's an interesting response from Rentfaster, which is it's a rent board, right? It's a place you can advertise your suite for rent. I think maybe there's a liability issue there for them as well.
Potentially.
They want people to say, but people do say, and they go, oh, sorry, is that what you meant? Oh, I guess it really is illegal. Anyway, if it's on the city's website, it's much harder to argue that the Rentfaster people didn't know.
Yeah, so, I know that watching Edmonton and Calgary, they both opened up legally suiting of duplexes in the last 12 to 18 months to hit in a really broad window that put a crimp, and quite frankly, into some investors who are buying single family properties with illegal suites and avoiding the duplexes. Those ones got now rolled into, and Edmonton and Calgary seem to be progressive in trying to add more and increase the number of affordable housing opportunities, because I think they understand what that means to them as a city. Unfortunately, not every city is at the same level. I think Lethbridge, from listening, has some legalization of suites happening too. They're recognizing they need that. We don't seem to have the right combination. I don't know. I can't tell you whether it's a lack of administrative push or council. It comes from one end or the other. And I've always asked in, say, Edmonton or Calgary, what was it that pushed and spurred this? I think council finally got tired of all these applications being run at council meetings and said, go fix it. And I think Nancy was a force in that possibly too. But again, I'm kind of just on the periphery of that discussion without being directly involved.
Without knowing. So folks, as you know, as you listen to this, and I think about Edmonton, Edmonton took the position a few years ago that they were basically going to legalize secondary suites, garden suites, garage suites, anywhere in the city. There's very few places in the city where it is not zoned for that. Calgary is still, I think, doing it on they were more like Airdrie, where you have to apply on a suite by suite basis, and I think council got tired of that. So Calgary has opened up a lot, and there is a push for legalizing suites. But as we've talked about the various cities and towns, I think, as I'm just thinking back, not one of them deals with secondary suites the same way. Not one. There's subtle differences in every community. So I think the big takeaway for Alberta is that you need to poke at what exactly is going on in the property, in the town or city where you're looking to buy a piece of property. And I think if we push that out across the country, I'm pretty confident that this notion of zoning is local. It's in the hands of towns and cities. The province sets up provincial legislation within which cities and towns have to fit, and then within that fit, they get to make their own rules. So that, my goodness, this is why we didn't get finished diligence the first time, because there's so much interesting stuff to talk about. Wow. So I think we've beaten up the I want to put a suite in question, and what do I do?
And I can just add something to that for you. Okay. So I know somebody who had a fire in his secondary suite, and unfortunately a tenant passed away. So this is why it's very important. And he hadn't done anything wrong, by the way. There was no fault of his, but all the hassle he went through, not only with the insurance company, with the fire department. They tried going after other properties that he had and getting statements from tenants to say that they did, to basically be negative against him. And it was like a lot, like he had to hire a lawyer. There was all sorts of things where it was hugely stressful for a period of probably at least 2 years. And so this is why it's very important to be fire safe, but it's also important, if you're going to be putting in a secondary suite, just be aware there is a reason why, for the most part, they ask for certain things to be done a certain way. Now, this happened before the legalization process rolled out in Calgary, so I would make that point. But when people look across Canada at different areas where maybe the cities have not come in with the secondary suite bylaw or rules, this is why it's very important to make sure that it's fire safe. Because if a tenant cannot make egress, you do not want to be criminally charged with negligence causing death.
Yeah, such a good point, Andrea. Now, I think you said that this was an illegal suite, but it was safe. He'd gone through the process of making sure it met fire code.
Yes.
Okay, so then if it meets fire code, then the question is, does the simple illegality of it make someone liable for death? And I gather that, although it took time and money and effort, he was okay on that end of it. He wasn't found guilty.
He was never charged with anything.
So,
but, yes.
So in one of my Tales from the Trenches, I published a story about a landlord in Calgary who had that same situation, but I think the windows did not offer proper egress. I love that word. Egress is getting out, ingress is getting in. There's no rule, I guess, about people who want to crawl through the basement window into the suite, but there are rules about getting out if there's a problem. That's egress.
Yeah.
So he ripped out the windows and done that, and had met all of the other safety and fire code issues, except for a couple, and then the fight was on. So he thought he did a decent job, but he didn't quite do them all. And so a big battle, and I think his insurance company refused to pay, and there was criminal action and civil action. So if you're going to run an illegal suite, folks, make sure that if you were allowed to have a suite, or if you had applied for a suite, it met all the rules. Otherwise, you'll get your ass sued. That's what will happen for sure. But I want to say something else on that. No, I don't think so. I think this is a local thing. Wherever you are, you make sure you check your rules and check them hard, and get help from somebody else who's gone through it. Because I think sometimes when you check websites and look at kind of basic information, this is often a complicated question, and information can be buried. So if you're doing this for the first time, I would definitely get some help from someone who has done it before. And I would poke at it with the development officer or the planning officer, or whoever makes the rules in the province and town that you live in, and to make sure they know what you're trying to do, and say, listen, I'm a rookie. I don't know anything about this. I really want to do the right thing, and I really need coaching. So you can get around some of the complications of it. People think you're honest and trying to do a good job. You'll get a lot of help. Folks are good that way, generally speaking. What else? The duplex thing. So this is a segue, just because it's an interesting investment segue. So Neil mentioned that Calgary and Edmonton have recently allowed duplexes to install secondary suites. So if you have a duplex, that's 2 suites. You can put a suite in each side of the basement if you meet the rules. Now you have 4 suites in your duplex. So the notion that was being debated, and councils were thinking about it, had a lot of smart investors looking at duplexes that would fit for adding 2 secondary suites and buying them up before the rules change. As soon as the rules change, those properties are a lot more valuable. So I know quite a number of people who saw the changes coming. I know it's not guaranteed, is it? Just because council is talking about something, the mayor and council are having a discussion, doesn't mean that they are going to change the rules. But if your assessment is they're going to, then you get in ahead of the pack, and you can really get a lift when the rules do change. Something else that is a bit kind of fuzzier, but is definitely changing, are the rules around parking. So Andrea talked about parking, and Neil talked about parking a little bit. Whenever there are discussions about density and what municipalities and towns want to do with providing more accommodation, they always talk about density. And as soon as you talk about density, you have to talk about parking. And so if you had a property where you could easily put a sixplex on it, but zoning doesn't allow it, and even if it did allow it, there would never be enough room for parking. Well, there's a good idea gone. But municipalities and counties and towns are now talking a lot about eliminating parking requirements, some or all of parking requirements. They're looking at areas that have good public transit. They're looking at making sure that areas have services in an area, so that everybody doesn't have to drive to some giant mall in order to buy anything. So as soon as you have smaller areas that are properly serviced with bigger density, then you don't need as much parking. And that goes back to your example, Neil, about the developer in, where was it, in the East Village, who said that people are going to walk to work, and council said, yeah, I guess they are. And so there was fewer parking spaces required, less parking, fewer parking spaces. So if you hear in your area, your council, your local people saying, you know what, we got to get rid of those onerous parking things. We don't want people to drive anyway. Don't give them parking spaces. They won't have a car. Let them take public transit. then you can step up and buy some stuff and hopefully get ahead of the crowd. Anyway, that's you could also buy a lottery ticket, I guess, if you wanted to do that. Just a thought, just a thought. Question, never trust a website, says Kevin Russell. They can be outdated. Good point. Always take the time to call and start an email chain. Protect yourself and your investment. Yes, websites. As much as we think that municipalities and all those government guys have flotillas of IT people updating websites, often they don't, and information can still be stale. So that's a really good coaching. Thanks for that, Kevin. Let's move over to condominiums. So people may decide to buy a condo unit as an investment, or they might buy it to live in. Give us, Neil, let's start with you. What's your single biggest diligence tip if someone's buying a condo?
As an investor, the latest one is if you plan to have a short-term rental, which is classified as, someone help me out, 30 days or less, but Airbnb style rental, do your due diligence to make sure that your bylaws allow for it. And also be aware here in Alberta of an overarching case that happened with a decision about a year ago in Edmonton, where the interpretation of the Condominium Act may or may not be a pattern that a lot of other condo corporations follow, unless it's specifically written into their bylaws on the designation of that space and usage of it. I think last time we were together, we talked about my second one, I think we talked about, which is if you're not familiar with condo docs, get them read, because there's a lot of information in there. And the example I gave was where we have some of our properties now. We had cash calls on multiple units, and one of the other owners in that condo complex found out afterwards that if she had had her docs read, that it actually said that it was coming. If you had spent the time, and it might have changed some people's minds about investing in there. I mean, we still have them years later, but it was a tougher pill to swallow out of the chute, that's for sure.
I'm going to come back to those points because they're both good points, but let's hear what Andrea has to say. Andrea, do you have any condo diligence comments?
Yeah, I think it's important to certainly review those condo docs, but it's also important to talk to the neighbors, because sometimes in the condo docs, there's not everything that you would want to see. So especially if you can speak with somebody on the condo board, you may get more information than you would otherwise just from reading through them. I think the other thing that's important to kind of understand is there may be, especially maybe more so when it comes to older apartment buildings, typically condos are at a higher value than, say, just a rental apartment value, right? But when a building gets really run down and is not in a great area, it can actually devalue the condo so much that the building would actually perform better if you sold it as not a condo. And this is where sometimes people go through the assembly of buying condos in a building, because they're buying them for 50% lower than what they would if they owned the whole building, if they're buying the whole building. And this is something that I'm helping one of my owners with right now. So it's just a creative strategy. Like if everyone's tired in that building and everyone wants out, you're better to get everyone together, decondoize it upon the sale to the new owner. You'll actually get more money. So, sometimes people think, oh, condos, they cost more. Well, sometimes they can cost less.
Yes. No, that's that is a good point. And people who are in areas where real estate is galloping along are scratching their heads and going, "What the heck is Andrea talking about?" But in a place like Alberta, where there was a condominium conversion frenzy back in the early 2000s, beat up old apartment buildings were converted into condominiums, and those individual units sold for way more than what the per door price would have been if you were buying a whole apartment building. But then as we have a drop in oil and a tougher set of economic conditions, values dropped. And so I hear you, Andrea. It's if you have a bunch of tired owners, you can buy, in Alberta anyway, you can buy condos quite cheaply. And if you can collect them all, then you can decondominiumize the building, turn it back into an apartment, and have a something you now control fully, and that you can turn into a better performing investment. So that's good coaching. I think on the issue of talking to neighbors, I think that's really good, because again, there's a set of bylaws always for every condominium, and there's a way that things are supposed to be done, but you can find out from a neighbor how things are really done. If you've been diligent, you've read the condominium bylaws, and you go, oh, there's a couple of provisions there, I really like that. That's good. This is the way I want my condominium run. And you talk to the neighbor, and they go, you know what? They never enforce that. They just don't. Yeah, it's in the bylaws, but they don't enforce it. So you wouldn't find that out from analyzing the condominium documentation, or really probably talking to a board member. They might not say anything to you. And going back to Neil's comments, it was actually Aaron Burney at Field Law, that acting on behalf of a condominium corporation, that brought a lawsuit on behalf of the condominium corporation to determine whether or not they could prohibit short-term rentals in the building. And although, and this is a really interesting point, even though in Alberta, under the Condominium Property Act, you are allowed to rent out your unit. The condominium cannot create a bylaw that says you can't rent your unit. You can't do that. And so that's what the condominium corporation was struggling with. In the end, Aaron made the case for the landlord, and I know all you investor guys may not like that, but she made the case for the landlord that short-term rentals, like Airbnb, did not fit the concept of what the Condominium Property Act was supposed to say.
You're going to jump in, Barry. I think
Yes.
you actually mean she made the case for the condo board against the
Yes,
landlord.
she made the case for the condo board against the landlord. You're right. I misspoke myself. Thank you, Neil. And so they determined that short-term rentals are not rentals. They said it's like a hotel. It's like a hotel, and these people are guests. You're not renting. You're providing accommodation for guests. So in Alberta, condominium corporations can make bylaws to prohibit short-term rentals, and that's the diligence Neil was talking about. And the other thing that you have to know about that is if you check that out, accomplish your diligence, and go, yeah, for sure, I know absolutely. I've talked to the board, I've read the bylaws, I've had the condominium documentation analyzed, and there is no prohibition on short-term rentals. I can have an Airbnb. Well, yes, you might be able to have it, but the condominium corp can change their bylaw somewhere down the line. They can't change the bylaw to prohibit normal rentals, but they can change it to say we don't want short-term rentals. So that's the risk you take on that side of it. Now, what was the other thing? Neil, what was your other point? Oh, yes, getting the documentation reviewed and how important that is. I'm telling you, folks, you need to be able to look and read condominium documentation. You need to be able to read the reserve fund study, the reserve fund report, and the reserve fund plan that every condominium corporation is supposed to do every 5 years. And particularly, you're looking at, is this a well-run condominium corporation who does their maintenance and changes the windows out when they need to, and changes the shingles when they need to, changes whatever they need to change when they need to? Or are they the people who are avoiding that because they don't want to raise condominium fees, which inevitably down the line will end up in a big special assessment, because you can't put off that kind of stuff forever. So it's hugely important to read those condominium documents, and if you can't do it, get one of those companies that do it as a business to do it for you. And I actually recommend that to my clients, because it's a specialized task. So that's a bit on condominiums. Now, Canada-wide, I think all provinces have condominium legislation, but condominium legislation varies widely across the country. There's a general framework, but it varies widely, so that I think in British Columbia, for instance, condominium corporations, or strata corporations as they call them there, can prohibit any kind of renting. So in Alberta, you can rent, and they can't stop, the condominium corp can't stop you from renting. But in BC, they can stop you. And so there are also varying regulations across the country for how hard a condominium corporation has to work on making sure they know whether they have adequate funds to do the repairs and maintenance that any condominium corporation needs. That varies widely across the country. So even more than checking out the rules on secondary suites, you need to be very careful for the province you live in to find out what the condominium rules are, because they're vastly different across the country. Phew, that's condominiums. Anything more? Did that provoke any more condominium comments from either of you?
There is a question in the comments that flashed on the screen very briefly about if condo bylaws change to no longer allowing short-term rentals, are the existing ones grandfathered? Josh, who asked the question, I think that's such a broad question. I would have to defer to Barry, other than to add a comment in that in Alberta, to get an actual bylaw change put through requires 75% of the, not units, but unit factors, and depending if they're all different sizes, they'll have different unit factors. They need 75% of the voting factors to agree to make a bylaw change. So bylaw changes in condos in Alberta are fairly difficult to get. That said, if you have a short-term rental or two that are really upsetting a bunch of the owners, you want to see an annual general meeting at a condo corporation, the room be full like you've never seen, have a cash call, or have an issue such as maybe a short-term rental type thing. But normally AGMs are not well represented. So I don't, my gut says you can't grandfather anything, because if the bylaw came in, unless they had the words grandfathered in it. And that's why I've always said, if you're going to own a condo, get on your board so you understand what's going on, and encourage enough landlords to be on the board that you have representation, and more importantly, that you have votes. Enough votes to make sure you protect.
Neil, I did some research on stucco after the last live. You own a property in the Forest Grove complex in Sherwood Park, says Jared.
We do not, thankfully, but I imagine there's more than one up there. We were talking about stucco and building envelope failures at that session. And we had the unfortunate thing about learning about stucco and building envelope failure in our principal residence, carpenter ants. Do you know carpenter ants exist in Alberta? Yeah, we didn't either, but we know now.
Didn't know that. Oh my God. Oh my God. All right. On the grandfathering side of things, I believe that there's probably a better bet that if you set up your suite, set up your short-term rental, and then they change the bylaw on you, that you would be allowed to keep it. Guess it doesn't really work with short-term rentals. And maybe that's not how they do it. They keep it until your last short term moves out, and then you have to change. So effectively, they've changed it on you. Anne says, yes, it was the case with us. We bought a townhouse in Strata, BC, in Surrey back in 2009. In 2011, the Strata bylaws changed and rentals no longer became allowed. We wanted to rent our unit in 2016 and had to get special permission, okay, to rent it for 1 year. We decided to sell. There is Anna confirming that in BC, yeah, they can change the rule on just a basic rental. So yeah, carpenter ants in Bragg Creek, says Deb. Yeah, well, there's a lot of work to be done in Bragg Creek. You know, it's an upper level area there and lots of renovations going on. Carpenter ants are required. So folks, are you starting to get it now on the diligence side of things? Diligence is a multifaceted question. It doesn't really matter what question you ask about should I do this or should I do that or can I or can't I. There's usually a whole bunch of things to ask and to understand and to check out in order to make sure that your investment is one that's going to do what you thought it was going to do, that you'll be able to run it the way you thought you were going to run it, that you won't all of a sudden get notices out of the blue that you are prohibited from doing something or you have to change something. So diligence is ultra important. All right.
Hey,
So I
Barry,
think
can we talk about apartment buildings?
Sure, let's talk about apartments.
Yeah, because just last week I was helping a client who's purchasing some apartment buildings, and due diligence is very important in multifamily as well, especially when it comes to boilers and roofs, and especially flat roofs. So we do get a fair amount of snow here in Alberta, as other parts of Canada do as well, and stucco buildings again. One of the things that we noticed was a common theme was tons of deferred maintenance and also weird looking repairs. So one of the things we were looking at, for example, is a few of these kitchens had been renovated, but when you looked under the kitchen sink, instead of the pipe coming down to the P-trap and then going out, it went this way, then it went this way, then this way, and then around, and then out. And I said, my little joke of it was, well, curves are great on a woman, but not on plumbing pipes. So, it's super important when you've had somebody who has run a building as if the caretaker cares about everything, but doesn't necessarily have the skill set to do all of these repairs, and in fact has made it worse. And we saw some really bad tiling jobs where there's literally humps in the bathroom floor, which to me is a huge issue for somebody to trip and fall and for you to get sued. So not only is the exterior important of the roof, and they had a roofing contractor there, we had a boiler specialist there, but one of the buildings had a furnace that was used for one room that already had a secondary heat source through the boiler. So here's this old furnace, still pilot light going, heating one room. Just insane. It's not even necessary. So, we look at the liability of having this gas going to this furnace that's not even really required. So that needs to be capped off and dealt with. But, another thing, of course, to look for in some of these older buildings is asbestos tiles. So, it's super important to do your due diligence when it comes to things like asbestos, when it comes to roofs, and even due diligence on your tenant profile. So especially in these multifamily that are run down, you don't want to necessarily buy the building not knowing if you have a drug issue, if you have a bug infestation, things like that. So it's super important to get into every single unit, not just this is the average condition of the building. You really need to know what you're buying, because on that multifamily side, you're buying an income stream. And if that income stream is in jeopardy because of the type of tenant that has been put into there, you really need to know that, because there's going to need to be a budget for some turnaround time to change the tenant profile, to change the reputation of that building.
That's a hugely good number of points about multifamilies. I think we talked a lot on the single family side of things about overall. We usually recommend somebody hire a home inspector, a licensed home inspector, to get your single family property inspected, and we recommend that even if it's a condo or a strata unit. But when you're buying multi, the issues and things that you can find in a single family are multiplied because it's a multi. I mean, so flat roofs, most houses don't have flat roofs. I mean, you got to have that roofing contractor. If you get it inspected, you need to have an inspector who really does most of their work in the multifamily area. And then that inspector probably wants to have along those other kind of sub-experts, the roofing guy, the boiler guy, maybe a window guy, and totally agree that you have to inspect every unit. I've had any number of clients who say, well, I'm going to do my diligence and I'm going to look at one suite that's above average and one that's kind of average and one that is not average, below average. And they're going to tell me how the 32 unit building breaks down into above, normal, and below average. But I'm only getting to look at 3 suites. And of course, you know how those stories ended. They bought and found that the seller's estimation of what was average or above average was not the right description of the units. So every suite inspected, get different checklists, hire a great inspector, make sure that, if he's a great inspector, he'll have great boiler guys and roof guys to come along with. Neil, do you have any apartment comments? Multifamily comments?
Well, some guy named Barry stole my comment, which was view every suite. We did a deal on a multi. Yeah, we did a joint venture deal on a multi back in 2015, and I'm trying to remember. Be aware that your legal costs to close will probably be more. That if you're trying to compare your financing to residential done through a mortgage broker, where the bank pays the mortgage broker to go do the deal, most commercial financing, unless you're dealing directly with a bank, and even then, they're going to charge you an application fee, or the mortgage broker is going to charge you some points to help you obtain the financing. So be aware of that. And one other one, because again, it's we're not the sweat, so to speak, in that deal. We're the equity side of it. But the other one is that Cmhc refinance rules changed last year. So there was an old traditional one, buying underperforming asset, get it up, get it normalized, they call it, do some reno, increase the rents, and go refinance it and have that mythical free building. Look really hard in that one, folks, because I can't say it for sure, but I'm pretty sure I remember reading CMHC saying that is no longer our mandate as far as affordability. And they don't use the same formula to calculate their appraisals. They do an internal appraisal on a different scale. So be aware that some of the strategies, if you're reading websites or old YouTube videos or promotional stuff or books, be aware that there are changes that have happened in multi. So be careful.
Okay. I would like to just see if there's any questions. I know Jared had another question. Let's see what he's got here. Looking at a house, lots of greenery. Seller has mentioned they have to put a snake down the pipes a few times. Can you include an inspection of the plumbing to the city sewer in that inspection, or would it need to be separate from the typical property inspection? All right, well, let's go to our panel on this. Andrea, what do you say about that?
So when you're having the home inspected, most home inspectors do not have a camera to put down there, but you can hire a plumbing company while you're at the inspection anyhow. It's easier time-wise. But it's also important to know where the main sewer line is running. Is it running out the front or the back? And if you see the little round curb cock, that's where you would know where things are going for utilities typically, because if the water line's going there, probably the sewer line is too. So you can hire a plumbing company. They will do a video camera so you can see if the sewer line has collapsed or not. It's also important to know that some sewer lines back in the day were made out of cardboard. So if that's the case, they can do a sleeve technique that basically puts a sleeve through the existing line. And that may be a more cost-effective way other than digging up your front yard.
Okay. Something else along that line is if there is a lot of greenery, if it's an older neighborhood, that is a serious checklist item on your diligence checklist, is to consider whether or not the pipes are clear, and then decide what you're going to do about it. So as Andrea said, you can hire a plumber to put a camera up the pipe and see what happens. Now, if you find that the pipe is plugged or has lots of stuff in it, you can try and do that repair. And you are responsible, at least in Edmonton, you are responsible for clearing that pipe from your house out to the city property line. The city is responsible from the property line out to where the main sewer line is. So it might be organizing a couple of entities, your private clearing of the line, and you have to get the city to do their end of it as well. I've had a few people, think that the city's going to come and clear it all the way from the main sewer line right to the house. Well, they don't necessarily do that. So that's a good, really good thing to do. Neil, anything on that part? Help out Jared?
The only comment I have with sewer scope is, to me, that's a newer one, but I understand the necessity of it. Our daughter with one of her rentals went through that on an older property where she had to get the roto-rooter, and if they forgot to get the roto-rooter, they had a backup issue. So I've seen it. It's interesting on our last couple of flip purchases in Calgary and sales that it's becoming more common. And I was going to maybe ask the group if there's a break point at which, if you're looking at a 1990, 95, 2000 house, that you don't need to do it anymore, or is it becoming a de facto type thing that gets done on a home inspection, unless like it's a brand new property? It's something that to me wasn't part of there, but the world keeps changing, and that's probably a good thing.
I don't know the answer to that, but that would be a good one to just put up in the group and see if we can get any comment on that. Andrea, I haven't seen cardboard for lines, but when they last dug up my front street here in the old Strathcona area of Edmonton, the pipe that came out was oak staves with wires around. So it's like a barrel, like a barrel. And it was the sewer guys were just in awe of it. It was just out on the street, and we're going, how has it lasted all this time? And it actually wasn't that bad. But yeah, oak staves with wire around keeping it together. All right, are there any more questions? Let's see if we can pop up another question. Track the vacancies, particularly if you have units in a rental pool. I have a situation where one unit, possibly two in a complex, appear to have been left vacant for 9 years because of engineering problems. Holy carapola. The board appears to have recently taken 1 year of revenue from the condo corp and moved it to the rental pool. Whoa, that's all supposed to be kept totally separate. The suggestion from the current property manager is they didn't get any documents from the old property manager when they took the management to something. There's a little more to that question. Wow. So I think the point here is that if you have units in a pool, you've got to check and see what's going on. But pretty sure that no condo board is supposed to mix the can you guarantee the vendors for condition? That's an interesting and wide-ranging topic to think that if there are vacant units in a complex, you have to wonder why they're vacant, and if there's a whole bunch of work that needs to be done, and if it's the condo corp's responsibility, gee, it better be the condo corp that's doing it. And what if it's a rental pool unit? All right, well, that's way beyond the scope of us at this point. Maybe Anna, we'll try and look at Anna's question here. With new builds, is it better to hire an inspector for the final walkthrough right before possession date? Or would it be better to hire the inspector right before the 12 months of initial warranty is up? Or I'll go you one better, Anna. Is it better to hire the inspector to watch it while it's being built at various stages of construction? And guess what? On my list of things that we didn't get to today is new home construction and inspection and permit issues that you have to watch for, because the landscape is, at least in my practice, changing a lot. I've got some surprising and disturbing revelations for our next round of diligence when we talk about new home construction and what all that means. So that brings us, folks, to the end of our evening. I'll do this last question. Barry, I assume you can see more legal action litigation in a hot market soon after it turns as opposed to a tepid one. I'm thinking of zero condition offers, no inspections just to get a deal in a hot market. Yes, a hot market can pose lots of different issues because people write offers without doing anything. They write them without any, they write unconditional offers above list, which in my mind can lead to lots and lots of trouble. So thanks, Andrea, for always showing up and helping out with your perspective. And Neil, I love talking to you. He just sounds so good and comforting, doesn't he? Neil and I should tag team. We get the three of us, and we could just call ourselves the Syrup Trio, and we could just soothe everybody's troubled minds. We're so calming, especially Neil. Though I'm pretty good.
You
You're
have the
pretty good,
ability to lull
but Neil's the
people to
best.
sleep here, yes.
All right, folks. Well, thanks for tuning in. Obviously, we're going to have to do at least one more diligence session. So our producer, Donna, will set that up. So we'll say goodnight. Thanks to everybody for showing up, and we'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.